Volume 4, Chapter 6, Charles Lee, Champion of Liberty and Guerrilla War. If the choice of Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army had been made on the basis of ability, genius, military experience, erudition, ardor for the cause of liberty, or for a combination of these qualities, this crucial appointment would not have gone to Washington, but to one Charles Lee. But political considerations ruled, and Lee, a native of Britain, had no political base. Mere merit was submerged, though some delegates did favor Lee for the job. George Washington and Charles Lee. No greater contrast could be found in their confrontation, and no more fateful choice of appointment could have been made. A decision which would bear heavily on the future course of the history of the United States. Washington, a half-educated, blunt, practical man, a highly conservative landed oligarch of Virginia, orthodox in his military and political views, a loser in his few previous battles, longed to become the head of a regular state army on the conventional European model. Lee, a brilliant, articulate, learned, déclassé, English intellectual, an ardent, witty, pungent individualist, personally and politically dedicated to liberty and deeply influenced by libertarian thought, an authentic military genius, had seen a great deal of fighting on the European model and saw its deficiencies for the American scene. It was almost inevitable that two such deeply contrasting figures, Lee was chosen by Congress as third in command of the Army after Washington and Ward, would come to an irreparable clash. That clash came to pass, and since the seemingly inescapable verdict of history was to give the victory to Washington, Lee sank into disgrace and oblivion, from which historians are only now beginning to rescue him. The major event in the emerging historical rehabilitation of Lee is the work of John R. Alden, Charles Lee, Traitor or Patriot, the first sympathetic biography of Lee since the mid-19th century. The Alden volume is indispensable. A growing appreciation of the value of guerrilla warfare has greatly aided in this reevaluation of Lee. Lee was that exceedingly rare combination, a brilliant soldier and a gifted intellectual. He was also the only general on the American side, with the exception of his old English-born friend, Horatio Gates, to have had substantial military experience. A fluent linguist and learned in political and military theory as well as in classical and English literature, Lee had been influenced by the strongly pro-Whig history of England written by a French Huguenot, Paul de Rapin, and later by the writings of Rousseau. After serving as an officer in the French and Indian War, where he picked up the apt sobriquet, boiling water, Lee performed with brilliance in the British expedition against the Spaniards in Portugal. Despite his distinction, Lee was retired from the British Army after the 7 Years' War because of his outspoken criticism of British political and military leaders, and his increasingly radical Whig views had lost him favor with the Crown. In England, Lee was received with warmth in important Whig circles and became a friend of the Liberal Lords Thanet and Pembroke, of Charles Yorke, and especially of the ardent Liberal Colonel Isaac Barré. Thwarted in his military career at home, Lee became personal aide-de-camp to the rather liberal King Stanislaus of Poland. His letters from Poland reflected increasingly radical and libertarian views, denouncing the aggrandizement of George III, Granville, and the Tories, toying with the idea of a republic, and praising natural rights and the American resistance against the Stamp Act. He wrote, May God prosper the Americans in their resolution that there may be one asylum at least on the earth for men who prefer their natural rights to the fantastical prerogatives of a foolish, perverted head because it wears a crown. Lee returned to England the following year, but his increasing radicalism again kept him from military preferment. Befriended by General Sir Henry Conway, he became an ardent supporter of the Rockingham Whigs and of radical leader John Wilkes. By 1768, he was contemplating running for Commons to effect a glorious revolution in Britain. He was also increasingly attracted to the American cause and habitually referred to America as that last asylum of freedom. At this time, Lee, Horatio Gates, and other pro-American British officers began to gather periodically for an exchange of views. In 1769, Lee was made an honorary major general in the army of the pro-Russian King of Poland. The same year, he joined the Russian army against Turkey and had the opportunity to observe guerrilla warfare by Turks and Polish rebel forces. Ill and failing to be granted a command, Lee traveled widely through Central and Southern Europe, visiting such luminaries as Emperor Joseph II of Austria, and growing ever more bitter in his correspondence against the Tory policies at home. He blasted the Prime Minister, the Duke of Grafton, as a man without conscience or honor, and wrote that if the axe is not applied to his neck, it is laid to the root of our liberties, national honor, and inheritance. There is no medium. More and more he spoke of being free in exile rather than submitting to the domination of George III. Excusing his lack of urbanity on the subject, for the Whig cause he ardently wished for triumph over tyranny, corruption, Grafton, North, and the devil. My puny dagger shall contribute its mite of annoyance to the breast of despotism and wickedness. And he passionately conjured up the spirits of Cato, Brutus, Hampden, and Sidney for the cause of liberty. George III was a reptile and a despicable, stupid dolt, while lords and commons were dens of thieves. Returning to England in the spring of 1771, Lee published in the press, though more circumspectly, a criticism of King George III, and also composed a lengthy, though unfortunately unpublished and vanished, critique of David Hume's History of England. He was irked at Hume's Tory apologetics for the Stuart kings, and he projected a satirical whitewashing history of the emperors Claudius and Nero, which he bitingly dedicated to David Hume. In the introduction to this critique, which has survived, Lee again attacked the Tory policies of George III, the use of pecuniary influence by the Crown, and the large standing army as instruments of oppression. Disapproving of capital punishment in general, he wished to preserve it for kings and their families, since the eradication of a royal house was surely preferable to the loss of a people's freedom. It is little wonder that the manuscript could not find an English publisher. In these final years in England, Lee became friendly with the great painter and ardent Whig Sir Joshua Reynolds, with Whig leader Edmund Burke, and also with the great radical Republican historian Mrs. Catherine Macaulay. Finally, Charles Lee, a major general in the Polish army and a lieutenant colonel in the British, consummated the exile for which he had long been heading. Eager to help the burgeoning American cause, he arrived at New York in the fall of 1773, where both he and the Americans were ripe for a revolutionary situation. For over a year he traveled extensively throughout the colonies, making friends with all the revolutionary leaders who were fascinated by his personality and by his military knowledge and ardor for liberty. In America he was no longer a maverick, but a leader in the American struggles with the British government. It was no coincidence that those particularly attracted to Lee were the radicals George Mason and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, Alexander McDougall in New York, and Sam Adams and his followers in Massachusetts. He became an especially close friend of Virginia's Richard Henry Lee, no relation, who truly wrote of him, "a most true and worthy friend to the rights of human nature in general, and a warm-spirited foe to American oppression." Charles Lee lost no time in lauding Boston's resistance to the Tea Act, and in urging energetic boycotts in reaction to the coercive acts of 1774. The crisis brought on by the coercive acts was obviously tailor-made for Lee's revolutionary temper. Taking up the pen as Anglus Americanus on behalf of active resistance, he urged a boycott and attacked moderation as submission to Britain. America was the last asylum of liberty, and therefore its defense of liberty was also a defense for the people of Britain and for the rest of the world. This was published in the Philadelphia Press, and a similar handbill was published in New York and widely reprinted in the New England papers. By this time, Lee's old friend and fellow radical, Horatio Gates, also forcibly retired from British Army service after the 7 Years' War, had also emigrated to America and retired to a plantation in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Both men were clearly ready to take up arms for the American cause. Lee wrote to Gates that it was incumbent on every man to contribute his mite to the cause of mankind and of liberty, which is now attacked in her last and only asylum. And Gates, known as early as 1770 as a red-hot Republican, replied that he was ready to risk my life to preserve the liberty of the Western world. When the First Continental Congress met at Philadelphia in September 1774, Lee was there, charming nearly everyone and, remarkably, writing the appeal which Congress sent to the Canadians for support in America's struggle. He also began in secret to draw up a plan for the organization of American battalions, a plan completed by the following February and which impressed many American leaders. Visiting Maryland in the fall of 1774, he induced the Maryland Provincial Congress to adopt his plan for organizing its battalions and even stayed to drill some of the troops. This plan of Lee's impressed Washington, who persuaded Fairfax County to urge a similar plan for Virginia militia, and prevailed upon Patrick Henry to get the plan adopted by Virginia the following spring. Lee published several essays on behalf of American freedom that winter, one of which pointed to King George's tyranny being exercised in Ireland and Minorca, and warned of its advent in America. In an uncompleted essay, he praised the Republican governments of Europe, citing contemporary policies of Geneva, Venice, and Switzerland, and in his letters he began to advocate armed revolution. Lee's most significant work, however, was one that called forth his military as well as his ideological abilities. The Tory Reverend Dr. Miles Cooper, Anglican president of King's College in New York City, had greatly disheartened the Americans with his pamphlet, Friendly Address to All Reasonable Americans. Cooper had counseled that resistance was useless against the mighty and thoroughly disciplined British regulars, who would be aided by large numbers of American Tories and German mercenaries. How could the undisciplined and untrained Americans even dream of opposing the British victors of the French and Indian War? No one was more qualified to rebut Cooper's charge than Lee. He had seen the highly disciplined Prussian battalions, the envied model of all the regular armies of the day, at first hand, and was creative and individualistic enough to be unimpressed. Lee leapt into the fray, publishing his Strictures upon a Friendly Address to All Reasonable Americans in Philadelphia in November 1774. He pointedly deprecated the British regulars. Their showy and much-admired massed formation, parade ground tactics were of no military importance, and the British only won the French and Indian War after discarding this pattern. Moreover, he argued, the highly touted victories of Frederick the Great were largely won by the Prussian militia rather than by the formally trained regulars. The Americans had numbers, zeal, and knowledge of the terrain on their side, and did not the amateur militias of the parliamentary armies defeat the professionals of Charles I during the English Civil War? Lee's pamphlet proved to be by far his most popular work. As the radical Salem Essex Gazette declared, it removed the terror the people had had of the British troops and gave them the heart to resist. Strictures was reprinted 5 times during the winter of 1774-75 in Boston, New York, New London, and Newport, and was also republished in American newspapers. Alden has concluded that the Strictures was probably one of the most influential pieces of propaganda in the Revolutionary period. After selecting Washington over Lee and Ward as Commander-in-Chief, the Second Continental Congress had to select the other generals of the Continental Army. The next step was to choose the major general who would be second in command, and the battle was rather naturally between Lee and Ward. Thomas Mifflin of Pennsylvania enthusiastically backed Lee, but he was bitterly opposed by Thomas Johnson of Maryland and by almost all the highly conservative New York delegation. As New England's candidate, however, Ward was the inevitable choice for first major general. After Ward was chosen, the New England radicals, especially Sam Adams, fought ardently for Lee as second major general. Though Hancock and the more conservative delegates from Massachusetts opposed Lee, the backing of Washington, who had been impressed by Lee's military genius, carried the day. All in all, Congress selected 4 major generals. The others were Philip Schuyler of New York's landed gentry and the veteran Israel Putnam of Connecticut, and 8 brigadier generals, 7 of whom were New Englanders. The preponderance of New England officers was natural, since the bulk of the troops then in the field came from that region. Chosen adjutant general with the rank of brigadier was Horatio Gates.